The movement of data across country borders is essential to the global economy. When data flows across border, it's possible to deliver more benefits for people, enterprises, and the planet. Digital trade has been the fastest growing area of global trade over the decade. It's growing by 5.4% average and contributing on more global growth than the actual trade in goods. And our study shows that cross-border B2B commerce is accounted for almost 2/3 of international digital trades, which is around 1.78 trillion. And you can imagine how much that can bring into a value. That said, international data transfer is not an easy job. It's really complex. Global leaders from corporate and data settings in public and private sectors, we need to take an action across all economic activities, and we need to have a collective approach towards how do we address that kind of an exchange using the technical solutions and also having the right legislative platform in place. There has been a lot of global movements towards such. Cross-border data regulation is really important to have in place. In country here in United Arab Emirates, the country have launched a data privacy law to make sure that we strike the balance between the data privacy and innovation and enabling businesses to still harness the value out of the data. So it's an interesting debate, and I'd like to start a round of questions in this panel with you, Laurie, if you don't mind. I think you are involved in negotiating data adequacy arrangements between DIFC and UK government. What is it like to negotiate data transfer with the national governments, and what aspects of arrangements DIFC had and most difficulties have gone through and also overcome at the same time? And it would be really interesting to see if you can shed the light some of the gains on innovations of such trade-offs.
Absolutely happy to, Your Excellency, and thank you so much, everybody, for the invitation to speak. This is such an important topic, and I really appreciate the question, because it's a partnership that we're creating with the UK. Since they left the EU, it's very much sort of contentious topic, and everybody's watching to see who their first adequacy recognitions beyond somebody that already has been recognized or a country that's already been recognized, the EU will be. South Korea was recently announced as one of their very first adequacy partner that they've reached in an in-principle agreement with. But the EU has recognized them as well. So who's next? What happens next? And will that be examined? Yes, absolutely. It will be examined by everybody globally around the world when the UK moves on beyond a common sort of adequacy recognition with the EU. I think it's really brave what they've done and decided to take their own stride in this and make their own decisions as to what they'd like to do with respect to adequacy recognitions. Thankfully, DIFC is one of them. We've been working very closely with the UK government for about 18 months now. And it's been a great learning experience. So in terms of the pros, it's been good for them, good for us, exploring what international transfers really mean and the accountability and the ethics behind international transfers, especially if you're sending data to an importer in another country that simply doesn't understand what it is they're supposed to really do with the data. They just want the business, or they just want to receive that data maybe to enrich their own data and have sort of missed the purpose. That is quite dangerous. And so getting that right, getting that balance right, and being arm in arm in that with the UK has been really, really fascinating. An experience, a really good learning experience, not just for us, but for the other financial centers around the region, and probably even for the government here themselves. Some of the difficulties have been the very same thing, to be honest with you. Understanding even within our own jurisdiction what happens to data when the UAE government or the Dubai government or even Abu Dhabi or what have you receive data from the DIFC. There is a data protection law in place. What happens, what are the protocols, what is being developed? They're watching really keenly and forming a partnership as well with the UAE to be able to come up with some sort of consistent and common approach. But getting there is taking time because of the fact that we need to make sure that everybody's in line and that it's well understood, for example, what national security data is versus what a sort of smaller universe of just generally commonly shared data is, and whether it should be kept here in the region, if it is, what happens to it, and so on. So that is one of the more interesting facets about the adequacy assessment that we've been doing with the UK. We've also been assessing other countries in that time, including the UK. I mean, we watch and see what they do and watch reports that come out, and it's not necessarily just a sort of honor that they bestow, which it very much is, but it's also it is a partnership. We want to know that when DIFC or UAE citizen data goes to the UK, will it be handled the way that we would expect it to be handled? And it is all about that, and they recognize that, and I think that's the really great sort of dynamic that they're trying to build. I mean, we have spoken with the EU Commission as well. We'd love to continue that partnership and see if we could do something similar with them. We're reaching out to others as well and taking the learnings that we've gained through the UK process and applying it to other jurisdictions so that we really do create a hub here in the UAE for ethical, accountable international transfers, and especially overlaying the technology developments that we're trying to achieve here. I mean, it's phenomenal, the work that's being done, so we need to work arm in arm together on that as well.
Thanks, Lori, for those insights. I think some keywords over here is having an understanding that goes bilateral is really important across different regulation systems, and different regulation systems comes with a lot of, I would say, sometimes restrictions or easing up of flow of information between countries, and that's a great segue to George over here. Snap products and services are driven by international data flows, often involved in individual, personally identifiable information. So what do you think in terms of CBPR? What do you want to see in this area? Do you want to have one standard, one global standard that everyone is adhering to, that have sets of regulations in it, or does SNAP prefer to see more of a guidelines that sets the rule and the principle for everyone to adhere to, and yet leave some rooms for innovation and creation of ad hoc needs when it comes to data flow cross borders?
Yeah, no, thank you so much, first of all, for having me. I think it shows again the sort of the role the UAE takes when it comes to the topic of data, and also the global role the UAE is trying to take. So really appreciate the opportunity here. So let me take maybe a step back. I think for Snapchat, which is a US tech company, it is sometimes very challenging. If you look at all the markets we have around the world and where we're operating in, each of them have different data protection regimes, right? With different requirements. Some might require data localization, some might require local representation. So for a company that's based in the US, sometimes it's very difficult to comply with all different laws around the world. Especially Snapchat is a big brand, of course, but if you look at resources to sort of put on that topic, the more resources you need to put towards compliance, the less you can innovate, basically, as a company. So I think that's a challenge we see overall. So looking at frameworks like this, I think it really comes down, what is the value add for companies to be certified under that? I think the second element, so I'm from Germany originally, and Germans love data, it comes down to the what and the how, basically. So I think regulators should be not too prescriptive in their mandate. They should really focus on what is the outcome? What are we trying to achieve here? What do we want from the stakeholders? But the prescriptive way of like how the companies should achieve that should be left to the companies, basically, because again, the how allows companies to innovate and find creative solutions to achieve the what.
So I'm hearing over there a cost of compliance and the objectives that we would like to come out with has to be set very clear in order to drive any cross-border international data. So that takes me to Michelle over there. Visa is a global digital business payment solution spanning many jurisdictions with different regulatory environments. What do you think of the CBPR framework does with regards to balance between common standards and adherence to another regulatory? Again, it brings us to the topic of compliance.
His Excellency, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak on this topic. And as others have said, I think it really shows the leadership of the region in trying to facilitate a dialogue that we really need to have about cross-border data flows. So, it's interesting about the regulatory environment. One can understand why this is such an important topic for governments who are trying to protect citizens, enable consumer data rights, think about cybersecurity issues. And so right now, the solution has tended to be about different forms of data localization. And at the same time, that creates, as my colleagues have also been saying, it creates a very fragmented environment to work in when it comes to data regulation. So I was looking at some statistics, and in 2017, there were 35 countries that had 67 different forms of regulation. By 2021, there were 62 countries with 144 different kinds of regulation, and it's just continued expanding from there. So, when you really look at the different issues with adequacy, as Lori's been pointing out, different country-level regulations around consent, that gets also very tricky. Even looking at the charts that show, here's all the requirements for each country, and here's this country allows this with that country. And if you're a global multinational organization, the fragmentation is mind-boggling. Some estimates say that it costs the global economy almost $780 billion per year, just from regulatory fragmentation around data. So this is an incredibly important topic that we get right. And, it's interesting because in some ways, the very data that is in question is the data that can help governments achieve some of those objectives. So, looking at sharing data about cybercrime, looking at sharing data about fraud can also be very helpful in trying to achieve those same objectives. So facilitating conversations like these and really thinking about how do we create more interoperability, that's something that we can really aspire to aid innovation and really help the global economy to grow.
We definitely need one common standards and not 144 regulations to be adherent to minimizing the cost of compliance as we go and making sure that the ultimate objective is very clear in front of ourselves when it comes to identifying personal or a regulation that has to do with personal identifiable information and its cross-border movements globally. And it's important also to make sure that we need to strike the balance between the innovation part, how much we want to innovate, versus how much we want to restrict and have a hard regulation in place. I'm in favor of always having an agile approach towards building any regulation systems. We do the minimal that we have at the moment, or we need at this moment, and then continuously evolve from there and build on it. One standard, but on an agile manner that we build on top of it. So I'll take another set of questions, and let's see how much in depth we can go into this topic. And going back to Lori over here, Lori, if you look at today the regulatory approach the DIFC have taken, and what is your view on CBPR relative focus on business and individual data? And over here we're talking specifically about customer and people data. Does it strike the right balance between accountability for businesses and protection for people? And how does it compare to the data privacy trust framework that you have studied so far? So where do we stand over there?
That's a very good question. I mean, the data is the data. It's always going to be the same set for all of us, really. It might vary between apps and requirements and what we need to share and to get what we as consumers want, right? But in the end, I'd rather know that my data is going somewhere that a certification and analysis has been done. Somebody has actually looked into this independently and said that company not only understands the data protection laws and maybe is even in an adequate regime, as they say, but has now this stamp of approval from somebody else that says they're actually employing this in their own organization. They're actually applying the data protection law and regulations and policies and procedures and everything like that into their actual organization. It's not to say that there's nothing else good out there. I mean, adequacy means that another government organization has reviewed and built that relationship that we talked about earlier, and that there's a certain level of trust that can be assumed when you're sharing that data. But in terms of the question about DIFC and what we've done, we have right in our handbook very clearly on data transfers saying that adequacy is just one mechanism. You can use that mechanism. You can sort of say, right, I think sending data to Germany, for example, is going to be relatively safe, but what about the importer? Has that importer actually met any qualifications or tests? Have you done any due diligence if they haven't? Because as I say, the data is the same no matter what. It's just, and it's going to be transferred. Whether there's localization rules or not, it's impossible to sort of turn that tap off, I think. You can't really just stop sending data to the United States or stop sending data out of the UAE or what have you. There's always a workaround. There's always something that's going to get that data to where it needs to go. The critical question, though, about CBPRs is, what does it do to enhance the safety of those safeguards? Because cost of compliance is one thing to consider. What it means to business to be able to innovate is another thing. I mean, the more you have regulation in place, the more difficult it becomes to innovate. I, as a consumer, want innovation. I do. But I also want my data to be safe. And that's what companies need to focus on as well. All the costs and everything like that kind of mitigate the risk. But that's mitigating the risk to the company. How does it mitigate the risk to me as the consumer? And that's the thing that we need to talk about when we talk about CBPRs or common consistent mechanism. Moving that sort of APEC framework into a global space, which the United States and some other players in the whole APEC organization are working on doing, is a really, really important thing to add to the list of options for mechanisms for transfers, because it gives you that certification, it gives you that comfort.
Thank you very much, Lori. There are a lot of points to unpack over here, but I would like to go back to Michelle. Visa encourages innovation through partnership, and often partnership happens with, I would say, small businesses that have a very small little team that to do with the regulatory compliance and how do they work with such a regulations that they need to adhere to. So how do you see CBPR working for them? Does it really make for data flow with a trust of boost of innovation, or really it has an impact on those businesses?
Yeah, this is a great point, and I appreciated when you were introducing our session talking about the value of the cross-border economy. It is massive. The cross-border digital economy is growing so fast. And when we really look at the financial services value chain, there are so many places where there are companies innovating at the edge. We're innovating around things like authentication, authorization, combating cybercrime, anti-money laundering controls. There's so much that we do that really relies on a steady flow of high quality, low latency cross-border data. And it's interesting how that facilitating cross-border trade, cross-border e-commerce for small businesses is such a massive, massive win. At Visa during COVID, we saw that the merchants, the small businesses that were the most digitally enabled were able to weather the COVID storm really well. Some of them grew. I mean, they not only survived, but really thrived because they were able to tap into cross-border e-commerce experiences. And the other day, my mom lives in Arizona, and she wanted to send my kids a Valentine's Day present because Americans love Valentine's Day, and so she went online. She found a shop here in Dubai, and she ordered online this Valentine's Day present that's going to be coming to my kids like tomorrow. But and it was so amazing, really, to step back and think about all of the data that needs to flow to enable that kind of an experience, and how important it is, especially on the tougher things like, as I say, authentication. Can you imagine what it would be like if that wasn't possible. And, would she send cash? Would she send a check? I mean, probably what she would do is send me to go buy something. But it's amazing the freedom of choice that it gives and the way that cross-border data flows really open up opportunities for small businesses for sure. Now with CBPR, it's interesting because I think that one of the challenges is that it can be very costly for businesses to comply, and it's costly for governments. I mean, it's amazing that here in Dubai, we're really the government's committed to investing in the certification program that's required, but on the face of it, CBPR does really put a cost burden on businesses and cost burden on governments. And it would be interesting to think about ways that we might be able to alleviate that as CBPR, which I think, it's been growing so much. There have been so many new advances, even the past year, about getting more countries on board. And as it grows and expands, it might be interesting to look at, is there a way for us to finance or help to provide funding for smaller businesses that need a little bit of help with their cost of compliance, or developing nations that the certification process and programs and everything that needs to be put in place are a little bit more onerous. So I think that it has so much potential, and I think we're just beginning to see the benefits of it, but really helping. The benefits go to innovations. They definitely flow down to small businesses, and it's so important for the economy.
It's interesting to see how you have seen the value on those companies when the end result was really clear as an objective over here, and how the global impact of a COVID, and the objective over there was very clear, to keep people safe. That brought all companies to innovate and bring out solutions. And those solutions worked during difficult circumstances. So it's really important to see those innovations, we keep them, we make sure that they drive a value, but yet also some level of compliance is really good because it creates the trust, it creates the assurance that these companies need in order to grow and to be bigger in the market. So I would like to again go from CBPR to local perspective here in UAE. I want to use my last question to you, George. Last year in the UAE, we recently issued a data privacy law, a little like the question we had to Lori. What is it that take to you that how businesses can benefit from such a law here in UAE? How does it support businesses, and how does it improve the privacy on people's data?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, a very important one. And I actually like, Your Excellency, what you said earlier, striking the balance between privacy and innovation. And I think the UAE Federal Data Protection Law really tried to achieve that. Yes, there are a lot of devils in the detail coming up now with the establishment of the data office, but I think most important is here to have a dialogue around this topic. And I think the UAE government has been really good in engaging the private sector in really creating this framework. So a lot of times if we look around the world, basically it's like government versus private sector. So the government looks at an industry or a company and has a role to regulate this company. And there's not much of a dialogue taking place. There are a lot of pre-assumptions that goes into drafting. I think what the UAE government has been really well, and especially also the Ministry of AI, who has been leading on that here in the UAE, was really to have a dialogue with companies around that. Listen, like, what works for you? What doesn't work? What are your concerns? What are our concerns? And really had a long conversation around that. So I think a lot of people said, like, it took some time to draft it. Like, timing's really late. But I think the government took their time to get it right. So I think we are overall quite pleased with the outcome because, again, it strikes the balance between privacy and innovation. So it protects your personal rights as a consumer, but allows companies to still innovate on it. I think the second part really comes down to government dialogues. And I think also looking at the announcement that was issued in November between the US Trade Department and the UAE government to really highlight the partnership and the appetite to work together on this important topic is, again, a right step. So if we can continue that ongoing dialogue, especially as technologies develop overall and data protection or the need to regulate will differ from technology to technology. I know metaverse, for example, is now a really hot topic here in the UAE, and how do we approach privacy in the metaverse, which is completely new again. I think, again, dialogue is key here, so therefore we were very pleased with the partnership with the government on this one.
That's great to hear over here. I've been part of the team who have had to do a lot of groundwork together between public and private sector in order to enable a draft of a law that suits what the government is trying to achieve into protecting people's privacy, and also what the companies are trying to do in order for them to innovate. And also over there is a dotted line between the economy, between the companies, between the government over here, and unlocking the potential that the digital economy can bring to us. And having that in mind, and having all of the conversation that we had so far, I would like to go with one round of a final question to all of you over here. The world is a complicated place. Nations are retreating behind borders. OECD reported recently that more and more countries are adopting data localization rules and requiring data to be stored and processed within their borders. There are signs, too, that these data localization measures are also becoming more restrictive. So the questions over here is, while CBPR is making a complete sense on theoretical level terms, that we have a chance to make a significant move towards having one global standard, but yet there are a lot of political also impacts on those. So what are your views? I would like to start from Lori over there.
Sure, that's a tough question. So localization, while I understand politically and even economically where it comes from, and of course, in terms of security, I think there's an element of it being understood that it promotes national security. If that's the approach that a government wants to take in terms of data in its borders, fair enough. It does impact the economic value of that data and the flows. It impacts our own lives as consumers. And so if we look to a system like CBPRs or something that is common, it doesn't even necessarily have to be that, but that seems to be one of the things that's already there that we can already look to and implement in our own organizations. Binding corporate rules as well have a sort of element of that, but CBPRs is a less kind of insular version of that. It gives you more room to maneuver and to be able to say, yeah, we've certified that we are trustworthy, and that's what it's really about, right? I have this trust relationship with this organization as the accountability agent, as the organization that's certified, and amongst all the other certified organizations, that at least the data that we are processing is going to be protected well. There are safeguards in place, there are guardrails for using that data, and we can call each other out on that as well and say, look, you haven't exactly complied. What are we going to do to make sure that that happens going forward? And I think it's a good basis as well for developing multilateral adequacy kind of structures, so multilateral data sharing with trust. I want to move away from the adequacy word sometimes and just, that's really what it's about, data sharing with trust. Do I think localization is good for certain things? Yes, but really, I mean, hackers are going to hack. They're going to get into even the local physical server. So if it's about security, it's not really stopping much else that could happen if data was traded or shared in the cloud or what have you. So again, having that CBPR or type of certification in place for the center where it's stored, where data is actually sitting, a mountain of data being accessed by others, will know that, again, those same safeguards and compliance kind of frameworks are in place to assure that that data will be safe regardless of where it is, in the cloud or otherwise. So yeah, I think it's a good way to kind of level set the data sharing frameworks for around the world. We'll see if we get there eventually.
Michelle?
I really appreciate, I think all of us have mentioned this need for more dialogue. And I think, the reality is that their absolute harmonization of country-level data privacy is not going to happen, because attitudes about data privacy differ. And so there's some element of CBPR that's really helping to alleviate the friction. And at the same time, we need to continue the dialogue. And I think, Lori, you're bringing up a good point about data free flows with trust. That the idea that cross-border data flows are not incompatible with enabling consumer protection and consumer privacy is such an important concept. And we need to kind of both, I think, embrace interoperability and different standards or certification programs like CBPR that can provide that, but also continue the conversation about demystifying the idea that the best way to protect citizens and consumers is to be more private or more closed, more localized. And that concept of data-free flows with trust, I think, is such an important one to advance the overall conversation and kind of bring this to the next level.
Thank you. George?
Yeah, the $1 million question. So let me give you 3 answers to one question. So total in alignment with what the colleagues here had before. It's all about the dialogue, and I think who's an important stakeholder in this dialogue are actually startups and small, medium businesses, because they are going to be affected by regulation the most. So they really need to raise their voice, raise their concerns early on, engage into that dialogue on how this could affect their business model. So I think it's, number one, all about the dialogue. I think number 2 really comes down to the element of data localization. This is maybe not the most prominent way, but I think it's what the others also said. It's really about what are you trying to solve for? Security and economic purposes. Data localization does not really solve the data access question, right? Only because you have data in that country doesn't mean you can go physically to a data center and demand the data. Economic empowerment, yeah, maybe. Local players will benefit from it. You will build a couple of data centers. But if you look at the digital economy more broadly, I guess this is also not the best way to achieve that. And last but not least, what Michelle said as well is very true. I think especially Snapchat as a US tech company coming into these dialogues and saying to different governments around this world, this is the best standard, follow these standards, not going to work. Every country is different. You have cultural nuances, etc. So yes, while there's a need for a global framework, there are always local nuances that need to be accounted into that.
Well, a lot of interesting inputs that we can end up this interesting conversation. And as I said, data is dear to my heart. And I can go on and on and on until the end of the day. And still this debate would need to have, as you said, an open dialogue around complicated challenges that has to do with cross-border exchange of data. But what's really important, and we came throughout the conversation too, is what is it, the end result of what we are trying to achieve over here. Let's have the end objective clear rather than the mean towards what we want to achieve over here. So with that final input, I would like to thank you all in joining me in this interesting debated conversation, and looking forward to have many more under the theme of World Government Summit. This is exactly what is it intend to do, and hopefully we move one step closer to having one global standard that we can share and exchange data through. Thank you.